Good morning, guys. Hope everyone's doing
Yeah.
well. Hey, Troy. Um, First, we'll start with a quick reminder that tonight is Lori Olin presenting for LA Days. So I definitely encourage you to attend that. If you can only attend one LA Days lecture, then tonight is probably the one. So I would recommend that you go to that, get your extra credit. Um, Yesterday was the first candidate for the landscape architecture slash landscape design and contracting position. Hopefully some of you attended that. There are going to be two more next week. So please attend those and give your feedback to the department about the candidates because we want to make sure that we have plenty of student input so that we get the best person for the position. Um, Today we will be moving on to our next topic. So let me share my screen here. All right. So today we're going to be talking about landscape pattern and ecological function and how some of the patterns that we've started to discuss impact function of landscapes. So as you recall, a matrix plus the patches that it contains plus the corridors that connect those patches is known as mosaic. So mosaic in simpler terms is basically just a collection of ecosystems. And when we talk about the functioning of ecosystems, one of the topics that we like to look at is thinking about how ecosystems benefit humans, right? So there's kind of the point of view that ecosystems are worth preserving in their own right, uh, but a lot of times that doesn't necessarily get the attention of developers because they're more profit oriented and financially oriented, or municipalities for that matter. And so, one way of thinking about ecosystems and their importance is thinking about how they benefit humans and how they benefit human society in some of the purposes that they can fulfill. And the term that's used to describe this is ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are defined as the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species that make them up sustain and fulfill human life. So, in short, they are the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. Ecosystem services are the benefits that humans rely upon from functioning ecosystems. So they include things like clean air to breathe, pest and disease control, carbon sequestration and storage, and so on. Well functioning ecosystems provide reliable and clean flows of water, productive soil, relatively predictable weather, and many other essentials for human well being. People, companies, and societies rely on these services for raw material inputs, production processes, climate stability, and many other goods and services, right? So there are a lot of different important functions that ecosystems serve that can sustain human life, not just life of the natural world. Um, let's see if I want to go into any of this. Nope, that's fine. So there are four categories into which ecosystem services can be divided. The first category is known as provisioning services, and those are the direct and tangible products that ecosystems provide for us. So these include things like food, feed, meaning food for livestock, fiber or other raw materials for buildings, such as wood, fuel, such as firewood or algae, fresh water for our drinking, and as well as pharmaceuticals or drugs. So one thing to consider is that 70% of all drugs in medical or recreational use today are derived from plants, right? So plants are a really important source of lots of different means that we use for just sustaining human civilization. But it's not just about the direct and tangible products that ecosystems provide for us. There's also a whole category known as regulating services, and those help to maintain a consistent and predictable environment for humans to live in. So examples include microclimate maintenance, air quality improvement, erosion control through the actions of vegetation and plant communities, waste treatment through wetlands, and flood mitigation through coastal reefs and beach dunes, right? So these are sort of these are also sort of direct benefits, but they're direct benefits that are not available all the time. They're direct benefits that are basically regulating the environment, and some of them are acting all the time, like microclimate maintenance and air quality improvement, but others like erosion control or waste treatment only get used periodically. The next category is supporting services, and these are the indirect benefits that we derive from the natural processes that support all other benefits and make ecosystems possible in the first place. So these include things like maintenance of genetic diversity, which is important for healthy populations to continue to adapt to changing conditions, particularly when we're talking about things like climate change. Photosynthesis, which allows leaves to convert sunlight into food and oxygen. Nutrient cycling, which allows for the foods that we eat to be nutritious. And soil creation, which provides substrate upon which all ecosystems and plant life grows. And then finally, the fourth category is what's known as cultural services. And these encompass many of the activities and emotions really that ecosystems allow us to engage in. So these include recreation and exercise, tourism, physical and mental health, the feeling of sort of a spiritual connection to the natural world, and other cultural services, right? There are examples from all over the world of the ways in which cultures value or connect with or have some kind of a sort of deeper symbiosis with the landscapes in which they arose or in which they live, right? So many of you, I imagine, enjoy living in Colorado, partly because of the natural landscapes that we have here to enjoy and the ability to go for a hike or to go for a bike ride and to feel a connection with that natural world that you don't necessarily get sitting in your house on a cold and snowy day, or being in a more urban environment. So thinking about the benefits that are provided by ecosystems is one helpful way to ensure that they are preserved and nurtured. But it's still not enough because, again, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of forces at work that are typically, they're financial in nature in terms of, let's say, that a municipality is considering a development proposal for a particular site. They tend to look at it in terms of how much tax revenue can we get from that site. And of course, many of them are also looking at quality of life and things of that nature, in which case ecosystems certainly would play in. But when they're just looking at sort of the bottom line and what kind of tax benefit they could get from a particular development proposal, then they're thinking about more than just what that sort of, even if it's a tangible benefit, they're thinking about it in other ways. So this is just a diagram that shows some of the different types of environments in which humans live and recreate, and some of the services that are provided by the ecosystems in those areas. And I won't read off all of these here, but you can see some of those listed here. And there's been an attempt in recent years to think about what are these things worth to you or to humans in general, right? What are these ecosystem services worth to society? And so a new sort of field of research cropped up starting, let's see if I have the date here. I think it was about 20 or 25 years ago, where they began to think about how do you place a dollar value on some of these ecosystem services that we've just talked about. So the field of ecosystem service valuation came into being, and that refers to the process of applying dollar values to ecosystem services. It's a growing field that compares production data for ecosystem services to the cost for humans to provide those services artificially without the help of natural processes. So if you can demonstrate the economic value of ecosystem services, then you can get politicians and commercial interests to pay attention and affect policy change to encourage and maintain the ecosystems that we currently have and that exist. So one of the ways to think about this is, for example, wetlands provide a cleansing process for water, right? So you have stormwater drainage. Sometimes it ends up in wetlands. A lot of times that stormwater drainage is carrying contaminants in it. And wetlands happen to be pretty efficient machines at removing those contaminants from stormwater before it's released into downstream water bodies like lakes and rivers and streams and so forth. And so what would it cost for humans to put into place a system to artificially clean that water before it's released into those water bodies? And so that's one of the ways that they look at how you can place dollar values on some of these types of services. This movement has faced some criticism for attempting to put an economic value on a resource that many people consider to be priceless. But it has been an important driver in recent efforts to protect the environment, since the economy is the #1 driver of policy in most cases. By placing a price tag on ecosystem services, activists have been able to get the attention of politicians and other decision makers and convince them that conservation is in their best economic interest. In addition, ecosystem service valuation can also help agencies make difficult decisions about the best way to manage a piece of land. So sometimes it can be used when development proposals are being made and trying to figure out which are the most valuable in terms of dollars and cents ecosystems that need to be preserved on that particular piece of land. And so this is often referred to as TEEB, TEEB, or the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And that is an international study that has been led by Pavan Sukhdev, who is an environmental economist. And the idea is that if you can demonstrate the economic value of ecosystem services, then you can convince, well, that was what I just said in the last slide. You can basically affect change in policy and development decisions. And so they've developed a whole host of spreadsheets that look kind of like this, that allow people to basically enter data about the types of ecosystems that are on a site that's being proposed for development, and figure out what the economic value of those particular ecosystems are. And in fact, whoop, sorry, this site, this apparently blank slide is not working. Oh, it is working. It's just slow. There we go. So this is a link to TEEB's website. We'll let it load for a second here, but basically they have a website where they've tracked various projects that they've engaged in around the world and looking at how TEEB has been effective at protecting various landscapes and ecosystems. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. And some of the ways in which it's been used. They have a whole series of case studies on their website. You can also download some of those spreadsheets I was just talking about so that you can use them to figure out the value of the ecosystems on a particular development project. I thought this would let me scroll down on the site here, but not really. So anyway, if you guys would like to explore this, the website is just teebweb.org. So TEEBWEB.org. And you can look at some of their case studies and some of the projects that they've been engaged in around the world. All right, so what is the best predictor of ecosystem health and resiliency? Does anyone have an idea? If there's one thing that you could point to that would be the best predictor of ecosystem health and resiliency, what would it be?
Biodiversity.
Biodiversity. I might have accidentally flipped through the slides too quickly and shown that. But yes, biodiversity is the correct answer. So in any given landscape, if you look simply at the number and diversity of species that are present in that landscape, that is the best indicator of whether or not that is a stable, healthy, and functioning landscape. And we have a little TED presentation on that.
Diverse, thriving ecosystems may seem like permanent fixtures, but they're actually vulnerable to collapse. Jungles can become deserts, and reefs can become lifeless rocks, even without cataclysmic events like volcanoes and asteroids. What makes one ecosystem strong and another weak in the face of change? The answer, to a large extent, is biodiversity. Biodiversity is built out of three intertwined features: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. The more intertwining there is between these features, the denser and more resilient the weave becomes. Take the Amazon rainforest, one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth due to its complex ecosystems, huge mix of species, and the genetic variety within those species. Here are tangled liana vines, which crawl up from the forest floor to the canopy, intertwining with treetops and growing thick wooded stems that support these towering trees. Helped along by the vines, trees provide the seeds, fruits, and leaves to herbivores such as the tapir and the agouti, which disperse their seeds throughout the forest so they can grow. Leftovers are consumed by the millions of insects that decompose and recycle nutrients to create rich soil. The rainforest is a huge system filled with many smaller systems like this, each packed with interconnected species. Every link provides stability to the next, strengthening biodiversity's weave. That weave is further reinforced by the genetic diversity within individual species, which allows them to cope with changes. Species that lack genetic diversity due to isolation or low population numbers are much more vulnerable to fluctuations caused by climate change, disease, or habitat fragmentation. Whenever a species disappears because of its weakened gene pool, a knot is untied and parts of the net disintegrate. So, what if we were to remove one species from the rainforest? Would the system fall apart? Probably not. The volume of species, their genetic diversity, and the complexity of the ecosystems form such rich biodiversity in this forest that one species gap in the weave won't cause it to unravel. The forest can stay resilient and recover from change. But that's not true in every case. In some environments, taking away just one important component can undermine the entire system. Take coral reefs, for instance. Many organisms in a reef are dependent on the coral. It provides key microhabitats, shelter, and breeding grounds for thousands of species of fish, crustaceans, and mollusks. Corals also form interdependent relationships with fungi and bacteria. The coral itself is a loom that allows the tangled net of biodiversity to be woven. That makes coral a keystone organism, one that many others depend on for their survival. So, what happens when destructive fishing practices, pollution, and ocean acidification weaken coral or even kill it altogether? Exactly what you might think. The loss of this keystone species leaves its dependents at a loss too, threatening the entire fabric of the reef. Ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity together form the complex tangled weave of biodiversity that is vital for the survival of organisms on Earth. We humans are woven into this biodiversity too. When just a few strands are lost, our own well being is threatened. Cut too many links, and we risk unraveling it all. What the future brings is unpredictable, but biodiversity can give us an insurance policy, Earth's own safety net, to safeguard our survival.
All right. So just to recap from that video. So what were the three types of diversity that help support biodiversity? There were three in particular they talked about.
Ecosystem, species, and genetic.
Correct. Ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity, right? So each of these helps to support overall biodiversity. And the greater the biodiversity, the more likely that you are to have a healthy and functioning and more importantly, resilient landscape. And the resilient part is important because landscapes are sort of under a whole host of attacks all of the time, right? You have pressures from human development, you have pressures from global climate change, you have pressures from maybe a disturbance regime like a forest fire or a windstorm or something of that nature. And the greater the biodiversity and the greater the various links in that web, the more likely it is that that landscape can survive those pressures. So this is a diagram that shows the 25 terrestrial hotspots of biodiversity in the world. And some of them are ones that you're probably familiar with. That would be predictable, like the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. But then there are some others here as well that you may not be as familiar with, like Southwestern Australia, the sort of coastal regions around the Mediterranean basin, at the Caribbean and so forth. So there's a whole variety of places that are known as these terrestrial hotspots of biodiversity. And the reason that we specify terrestrials is because, of course, the number one source of biodiversity in the entire world is, what's the most biodiverse type of landscape or place on the surface of the earth?
Tropical rainforests or oceans.
Tropical oceans is the answer I was looking for, right? So our aquatic ecosystems are by far the most biodiverse. So these are the ones, these 25 that we see in this diagram are the most productive of the terrestrial ecosystems. Come on, there we go. And by the way, in case you're wondering how, I don't know why this thing is being so fussy. Sorry, I am having issues with my controls here. Let's try this. That's better. Okay, so in case you're wondering how these were determined, there are two criteria that were used to identify a biodiversity hotspot. One is that they must contain at least 1,500 species of vascular plants that are found nowhere else on Earth. These are known as endemic species, and they must have lost at least 70% of primary vegetation. So meaning that these are places that are under threat from various pressures, right? So these are places where we need to protect those remaining sources of biodiversity because they're under extreme threat. I don't know why my keyboard just stopped working. All right, so let's talk about the types of heterogeneity and how this impacts landscape and ecological function, and how all of this, how all of these ideas about biodiversity tie back into landscape ecology, right? So if we're looking at an example of two different landscapes, which one do you think would be more resilient, more biodiverse, and which one would offer the greatest number of ecosystem services, right? And in this case, we're looking at compositional heterogeneity. So what that means is that there's a wider variety of different types of ecosystems within that landscape, right? So which one do you think is offering greater biodiversity, greater ecosystem services, and is more resilient?
One on the right for sure.
The one on the right, that is correct. So as you have increasing compositional heterogeneity, you have increasing biodiversity, greater ecosystem services, and greater landscape resiliency. Whoops, I keep forgetting I have to use this. Okay, now let's look at configurational heterogeneity, right? So configurational heterogeneity refers to the ways in which the existing ecosystems are configured on the landscape, right? So how many different sizes of patches do you have? What's the diversity in the shapes of patches? Things of that nature. So again, which one do you think is more resilient, more biodiverse, and which one has greater ecosystem services?
Is it on the right again?
Yep, the one on the right again. So it turns out that configurational heterogeneity is also a good predictor of biodiversity. Right, so what are some of the trade-offs that we're talking about? Because just because greater heterogeneity leads to greater biodiversity doesn't mean that it's all good in the hood and that, you know, we always want to strive for greater heterogeneity. There are trade-offs involved, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but this is a good diagram that gives you an idea between configurational heterogeneity and compositional heterogeneity and what some of the trade-offs are or the implications for greater heterogeneity. So if you're moving along this axis here so that you're going from more compositional heterogeneity to less compositional heterogeneity, one of the benefits of that is that you get greater effective area per species, right? Because you have fewer different types of ecosystems in that landscape. And so the landscapes remaining have larger land areas and you have a greater effective area per species. As we move from less configurational heterogeneity to more configurational heterogeneity, the obvious implication of that is that you have greater fragmentation, right? And as we've seen earlier, that can have impacts on the movement and distribution of species. And then niche space is another one that's impacted, right? So as you go from less compositional heterogeneity to more compositional heterogeneity, you get a greater diversity of niche spaces for different types of species to be able to thrive in that particular landscape, right? So the greater the number of types of environments that you have in that landscape, the greater the number of species that it can support. right? So if we look at a couple of landscapes here and think about which one is healthier, more resilient, and more biodiverse. Here we have a more or less homogeneous landscape made up of a mix of conifers and hardwoods. And here's one that's more heterogeneous, right? It's got some water bodies, it's got grasslands, it's got forested areas. So which one would you predict to be more resilient, biodiverse, and just overall a healthier landscape?
Probably the heterogeneous.
Probably the heterogeneous, and you'd be correct. Let's look at another example. Right, so in this case, we have a more or less homogeneous landscape of a grassland. And here we have one that's impacted by development, by human development, right? So you can see there's some buildings in there, some indications of roadways, you have some grasslands, some forested areas. Which one would you consider to be more resilient, more biodiverse, and a healthier landscape? And healthy is kind of a, you know, there are a lot of ways that you can unpack that term. But if we just think about which one's more resilient, more biodiverse, which one would you point to? Let's go with Janaka. Hello. All right, let's try John.
I'd say heterogeneous. I'm right.
The more heterogeneous one, even though it's heterogeneous as a result of human impacts, it's still providing greater biodiversity and resiliency because of the fact that there's a greater diversity of habitats there for different types of animals. And that tends to lead to greater biodiversity and therefore greater resilience. Right, so if we're looking at a diagram that's showing greater landscape heterogeneity, so if we look at the diagrams on the bottom, where there's little landscape heterogeneity, and then as we move to the right, increasing levels of both compositional and configurational heterogeneity. Well, one of the things that we notice is that as you increase in overall heterogeneity, vegetational complexity increases. So you're getting a wider variety of different types of plants, and the complexity of the plant communities that you get also increases, right? Because you have, again, a wider variety of different types of habitats and ecosystems. And then at the top, we have some diagrams showing the number of interactions and network nestedness. So network nestedness just refers to the different ways in which organisms can move through that landscape. And with greater landscape heterogeneity, you tend to have greater number of interactions and greater network nestedness, right? So there are more interactions and there are more opportunities for organisms to move through that landscape in a variety of ways, right? So these are all good things in terms of biodiversity and in terms of thinking about the resiliency of an overall landscape. I can get my mouse over here. So if greater heterogeneity is equal to greater biodiversity and more resilient landscapes, why are we so concerned with human development and fragmentation, right? Because human development and fragmentation tends to lead to more heterogeneous landscapes. So why is that such a concern for us?
We make a lot of waste.
We make a lot of waste. That's one part of it. What else?
We can also limit the movement and the flow through ecosystems.
Absolutely. So some of the heterogeneity that humans introduce are types that actually inhibit the movement of species. So that greater amount of diversity in the landscape types doesn't always lead to greater movement of species. And also the way I phrased the question was a little bit misleading maybe, because human developments actually tend to be very homogeneous. So when when you have development that's first introduced into a natural landscape, there's an increase in the amount of heterogeneity. But if you allow an area to become completely dominated by human development, then that heterogeneity goes back down again, right? Because human development patterns tend to actually be very homogeneous. So when agriculture is developed in a particular area, it's usually not mixed with lots of other land uses. More often than not, the predominant land use in that area is going to be agriculture. And so you end up going to a much more homogeneous landscape because it's all of that diversity that was there before tends to be removed and replaced with agriculture. So it's really the ways in which humans develop places. If you develop them, if it's slow and piecemeal and it has different types of land uses, then it does tend to increase the heterogeneity and the biodiversity. But over time, as humans become the predominant species in that location, that goes way down and you get a much more homogeneous landscape. Or maybe the battery in my keyboard just died. So what you tend to have is a large number of a small variety of landscape types with human development, right? So you have a handful of different landscape types and lots of those. And so that is what tends to actually decrease over time the heterogeneity of a natural landscape. But there's a second reason that human development and fragmentation are concerns. Does anyone know what that second reason might be? So I'll give you a hint. Is that fragmentation affects different species differently. What do I mean by that?
I guess like you mentioned earlier, I think in the semester, like certain animals such as like squirrels and stuff will kind of thrive off of us, and other animals that are kind of more timid around people will not enjoy it as much, I guess.
That's definitely part of it. But this is actually something that we see even where humans are not necessarily always active in that landscape. So if we go in and we cut out portions of a forest, we harvest that timber and remove it, and then the humans go away, and that leaves behind a fragmented landscape.
Does it have to do with connectivity
It has to do with connectivity.
and, I don't know, patterns of migration for different species?
Yeah. So what's one of the important considerations when we're thinking about patterns of migration and patterns of dispersion of species?
Would it be like habitat loss for like the specific species that we're like impacting?
Yeah, habitat loss. And so the species that we tend to impact are, and the ones that we actually tend to pay attention to are large mammals and apex predators. Those tend to be the first to disappear, right? So it has to do with the amount of area that species has available for its range. And its range just refers to the overall land area it needs to complete its life cycle. And so the range of large mammals and apex predators are the largest of the various species that we look at. And therefore, they tend to disappear first when there's fragmentation, because even though that fragmentation might not have a big impact on squirrels and mice and rodents or even certain species of birds, it's going to have a huge impact on things like bears and elk and wolves, for example. So those are the types of species that we tend to notice disappearing. And those are the ones that we become concerned about, and that landscape fragmentation tends to harm the most. So that's a second reason why human development and fragmentation become such big concerns in these larger landscapes. Even though it's true that on a number of species in that area level in terms of looking at pure biodiversity, yes, actually, believe it or not, human intervention results in a greater number of species in that landscape, but it can lead to severe reductions in specific species that we tend to be concerned about. So let's look at an example of configurational heterogeneity and in action, and think about its impact on the larger landscape.
From zebra stripes to cracked mud to honeycombs, patterns abound in nature. Are these patterns just pleasing to the eye, or do they reveal something about biological processes? For ecologists, understanding the mechanisms underlying vegetation patterns can provide insights into ecosystem dynamics. Karina Tarnita never imagined biology would be her destiny. As a 3-time Romanian mathematical Olympiad champion, she excelled in geometry.
I was a pure mathematician to begin with, so there was a lot of just sitting in my office and thinking about very esoteric problems. And then I think at around 25, I started feeling that math is getting a little bit claustrophobic, and I'm learning more and more about less and less. So I started to work on a mathematical biology kind of question. Africa, I think, is just fascinating because a lot of what I do has to do with geometric patterns, that in places where we have so many cities and so much agriculture, you can't see natural pattern anymore. Whereas here, you see it everywhere.
Karina has come to Gorongosa National Park, Mozambique, in search of new patterns.
Yeah, we're getting close to those 100 meters, eh?
One of the main features of the savanna landscape here are termite mounds. Karina and her collaborator Rob Pringle have shown that termite mounds are biological hotspots. Termites create rich, moist soils that enhance plant growth. When seen from above, termite mounds are islands of green on a drier and often more sparse background.
If you look at this perfectly polka dot landscape.
Wow, look at this, look at all the mounds.
Karina and Rob noticed that the spacing of termite mounds looked very regular. But how regular is it? Karina turns to a mathematical tool called a Voronoi diagram and applies it to satellite images of termite mound landscapes. She uses the center of each mound to generate a field of points that in turn partition the landscape into regions. Karina can now ask how many neighbors each mound has.
And so sometimes it'll have 5, sometimes it'll have 7. When you then average over all these counts, you find that the average number of neighbors is 5.99. So it's basically 6 neighbors. There was a eureka moment and I realized they're actually hexagons. They're packing the space in the optimal possible way.
What sort of natural processes could account for this regularity? To find out, we have to know more about termite behavior.
Termites live in these mounds. They are the centers of the territories. I'm going to draw them as these green discs. But in fact, they don't eat there.
Termites forage for plant material outside their mound. Eventually, they bump into their neighbors. Termites are extremely territorial, and this meeting zone becomes a battleground.
So what you find is that they put a boundary exactly at the middle of the distance between the 2 mounds.
So a major driver in the system is termite competitive behavior.
If the colonies are very different in size, then the bigger is always going to win and the other one is going to be killed. So that explains why they should be roughly of the same size and all the same distance from each other. Wow, so this is 30 meters. This is the neighbor. Perfect.
So termite competitive behavior creates the hexagonal pattern that allows the termites to optimize space and resources. But are the termites in Gorongosa National Park unusual? How common is this packing pattern of termite mounds across the thousands of acres of savanna?
Then it was just going to every single satellite image that had termite mounds. And every one that I took had exactly the same hexagonal pattern. That's what you hope to see. That's something that's repeatable in every environment where you have termite mounds.
Competition between termite colonies is not the only force producing patterns. Karina's model predicted that in the areas between termite mounds, she should find vegetation patterns at a smaller scale. To find them, she needs to look from a lower elevation. The drone is the perfect tool.
Oh, this is beautiful. This is really beautiful. So now we can actually see these patches of darker, drier vegetation intertwined with the lighter patches of soil.
The maze-like pattern may not be as obvious and regular as the mounds, but it becomes clear when analyzed mathematically. Together, these two patterns on different scales combine to reveal a fundamental dynamic of the savanna ecosystem.
Immediately after the dry season, everything dies out except for the mound. And as you get precipitation, you start to see that everything revegetates again. As long as you have termite mounds there, your system is much more resilient. So things like you have an increased frequency of droughts. You may end up losing the vegetation in between the termite mounds, but you're still going to be left with the termite mounds. If the precipitation comes back, they're going to be able to reseed the whole system. So they act as this double role of both delaying the collapse of the system to desert and at the same time helping with the rebound.
So termite mounds are not only major engineers of the savanna, they also contribute to the stability and resilience of the ecosystem. And the hexagonal pattern optimizes the number and distribution of mounds across the landscape. With climate change models predicting more water stress in some savannas, understanding these vegetation patterns on and between mounds will become a very powerful tool for monitoring such ecosystems.
They're hugely important for conservation, and they should be one of the primary things that we think of conserving when we think about climate change, because they're going to help us keep the system alive for a lot longer than we could otherwise.
Understanding patterns in nature leads to the discovery of new processes. Mathematics is the language of nature, and scientists like Karina are refining our dictionary of that language every day.
So that's just a good example of how natural processes can operate to bring about configurational heterogeneity, right? But of course, when we're talking about heterogeneity, in many cases, it's human interaction that creates a certain level of heterogeneity, and the heterogeneity that we're most concerned about. And so one question that might come up is, how can concepts of landscape pattern and heterogeneity be used to restore ecological balance, right? So thinking about how these concepts can be applied to real world sort of design and land use challenges. So if we look at typical agricultural development patterns, unfortunately, they're not terribly heterogeneous, right? If they're introduced into a larger landscape, small areas of them can introduce heterogeneity, but overall, when we develop large land areas, it tends to be very homogeneous. They usually look something like this, right? When you have an agricultural field. And so extreme homogeneity is an issue for some of the reasons that we talked about earlier, in terms of reducing overall biodiversity and ecosystem resilience. right? But there are other ways that we can develop agriculture. And one of these ways is known as conservation agriculture. And that can provide benefits for natural ecosystems. And in return, those provide benefits for human populations. So in this case, we have a different pattern of agricultural development where it's introducing a larger degree of heterogeneity into the landscape in terms of the development patterns that are utilized. And the spatial heterogeneity of these approaches can have dramatic impacts on ecosystem health and species richness. So this is a practice that's been gaining in popularity over the past 15 years or so, looking at how different configurations of agriculture on the landscape can help to maintain biodiversity, ecosystem function, and landscape resilience. And so we have one final brief film here that we'll look at today, if I can get to it. It's another TED Talk. And this one is a TED Talk by Thomas Waltz, who's actually, let me just pause this for a second. So this is a TED Talk by Thomas Waltz, who is actually going to be presenting at CSU's LA Days in April. And his firm does a lot of work on conservation agriculture and looking at ways that you can think about landscape pattern and landscape heterogeneity to have healthier agricultural landscapes. So this is his TED Talk presentation this is from about 8-10 years ago now.
The Conservation Agriculture Studio at Nelsonburg Wolf's Landscape Architects is a highly collaborative design methodology that seeks to lend the skill set of landscape architecture to land in need. We seek to rebuild the compromised, depleted, dilapidated ecological infrastructure in large-scale systems within active farmland. When I finished my graduate studies studying under Warren Bird, I realized that agriculture was the largest contributor of non-point source pollution in the United States. How is it that the way we feed ourselves can end up killing us? The toolkit that I had just acquired and was in the process of developing had shown me that landscape architecture is a profession that stands at the intersection of restoration ecology, soil science, horticulture, civil engineering. Could it stand also amidst agriculture? Could these tools be lent to this very important use of land in a way that rebuilds this infrastructure? You can dream all you want, and it remains theory until a highly enlightened client comes along and says, I'm willing to let you experiment with my land. That highly enlightened conservationist is right here in Albemarle County. And we began a project that has lasted for the past 18 years. He allowed us to experiment with his land, to do things we didn't really know how to do, like reestablishing warm season grass meadows. We began with a year of master planning, something I believe in today. This document, along with the subsequent hundreds of pages of drawings of schematic design through design development construction documents, but this document, this master plan, has guided the construction of this property for 18 years. We began with the waterways, rebuilding badly eroded streams and drainage ways, replanting them with marginal species to create habitat for amphibians and reptiles. We started to manage the larger open ground. We replaced the fescue, the non-native thatching grass, with deep-rooted warm season grasses. We reforested the edges. We then said, can we set your farm on fire? And he said, absolutely. So every 3 years, a big puff of dark smoke goes up in Albemarle County, and the ground plane is reset, burning out invasive plants, invasive grasses. You have this kind of sublime result of this blackened landscape that then quickly comes back to life with an incredible biodiversity. This is the composition at the end of summer, this rich bird habitat, small mammal and reptile habitat. So as we worked on this project, we realized we might have not been rigorous enough about documenting, about measuring, about who could be our scientific partners, who could help us gather data that eventually could be shared with people who couldn't hire us or hire scientists. Information that could be shared with extension agents around the country. The work of the studio started to grow in many, many different states and even abroad. One of the fun ramifications of this was neighbors started watching, and another very enlightened neighbor, a writer, poet, an actress nearby, she said, whatever you're over there doing to them, I want you to come do it to me. And so this is her managing her own burn of her native grass meadow. So a pretty exciting positive radiating influence. Now over 2,200 acres of Albemarle County have been managed in this method. We began a relationship much more rigorous with scientists. This has been a game changer for us, working with conservation biologists to give us the data of what are the compromised systems within a piece of property. So what I love is gathering a team of scientists and a team of designers from our office, putting them together, camping on site for a week to learn what are the dynamics of the site, what is compromised. You can't tell a designer from a scientist, and that's a dream come true. This is a white sheet that attracts moths by night, and we count all the insects, amphibians, the native plants and non-native plants. It gives us this baseline data. Then we begin to design with it. About this time, another very enlightened client came along and had acquired a 3,000-acre sheep station in New Zealand, and that's what I want to focus my comments on today. It's on the east coast of the North Island, 3,000-acre sheep, cattle, citrus, and crop farm that had been, as almost all farmland in New Zealand, have been highly compromised over generations of farming practices. This is the site. To those of you who love Bahamian Islands, this is sublime. To somebody who knows the ecology of New Zealand, this is borderline disaster. The native ecology of the North Island is temperate rainforest. Can you see a tree? The erosion was horrifying. The lack of biodiversity, saddening. So we set about a mission of could we retire the most fragile areas of this farm that should never have been cultivated. I'll show you some of the erosion problems. Some of this land that should never have been cultivated, could we retire that from agricultural production? Could we rebuild the wildlife infrastructure, encourage biodiversity, rebuild parts of the rainforest? This client said, yes, I believe in this. And for the past 12 years, we've been building a model farm for the country of New Zealand that demonstrates best management practices of agriculture with highly researched conservation biology, rebuilding these systems and reweaving them together. This map shows another layer of this project that has been a real game changer for us at Nelson Bird Wolds. This is the layer of cultural history. The cultural landscape is such a critical thing that remains often invisible. The traces of people who have been on land before you came. In this case, the Maori Great Migration arrived at this property in 1300. In 1769, Captain James Cook arrived at this property, his first landing in New Zealand. It was just north on the bay, not onto this exact land. So what you're seeing are three maps: the cultural landscape, the agricultural landscape, and then the green lines are the reforested landscape, rebuilding wildlife connectivity. But we're using the fragile, erodible slopes, rebuilding wetlands, places that really should never have been farmed. This was my first trip in a fragment of New Zealand rainforest. The scale of the plants is absolutely phenomenal. We created a partnership with the Maori leadership, who have become dear personal friends and tremendous supporters of this work. They really understand it. They see all land as an interconnected living body. And I would say my view of land is more connected to their cosmology than it is to perhaps the ones I've grown up with. This is what timbering in New Zealand did. We built railroad tracks right into the rainforest, put the trees and hauled them back out. This is what timbering looks like today. The highly erodible volcanic soils dissipate into the ocean. This is the scale of trees we're putting back. One of our partnerships with the Maori, the local Maori tribe, has been to collect seeds in native forests locally, propagate them. They have a small nursery, and then we buy the trees back to plant on the farm. So these go in, and I want you to watch this one cabbage palm that's still on the land. Each one of those white pegs represents a tree, as a stake for one of our trees. So far to date, we've planted 600,000 rainforest trees on this property. So I'm just going to pull back. You might want to grab your armrests so you start to get a sense of the scale of these plantings. We're reforesting the entire coastal edge so that this property will look as it did when James Cook landed in 1769. The wetlands, they'd all been drained to maximize grazing land. So we thought, let's rebuild them, but let's not pretend and naturalize them. Let's actually build them as a living, visible painting. Let's be artists here, but let's work closely with the conservation biologists and scientists to know exactly what we're putting back. So the ecological services remain, but that this is a visible designed construction, a kind of living painting, if you will. These are the grading plans, 2 kilometers of river, of deep water, and then 14 islands of varying slopes planted with different native species to become the homes of many of the flightless birds native only to New Zealand. We took inspiration from paintings by Roberto Burle Marx, a landscape architect from the 1960s, Brazilian, who was also a great painter. These are natural forms, but they're abstracted, so this was our inspiration. This was the construction site that lasted for nearly 3 years, 75 acres of constructed wetlands, where wetlands had once been 100 years ago. And this is the result. We have this spectacular broad landscape of freshwater wetlands and salt marsh. These are the pre-treatment swales that gather hundreds of acres of fresh water, filter them with plants, and then hold them in this wetland that is now filled with native birds. We also rearranged the agricultural lands of the farm. This is a citrus production, and you'll see we've reforested the edge, again with small trees, used instead of nylon screens, used trees shorn into shelter belts to protect the citrus from freezing. And then in honor again to this cultural landscape, to the Maori traces, in the distance in this image, you're seeing Mount Taranaki, a very sacred site to the Ngāti the local tribe that we've been working with for so long. This bridge is on axis with the peak of that mountain. So every day, the farmers, the workers, as they cross this bridge, they have this kind of moment of homage to a sacred site for the Maori. The Maori have a long tradition of earth mounding and earth building, fortifications, settlement sites, food storage. These are some of the traces that remain. This is a kumara pit. Kumara was a vegetable that the Maori cultivated from 1300 to today. These pits are dug out into the clay, lined with leaves, filled with food, and then arches of branches and leaves over to cover it from the wet weather. We wanted to honor these traces, honor these traditions amidst the farmland. As we're rebuilding ecologies, let's rebuild a respect for these valuable cultures that are nearly invisible. In this slide, we've oriented the drives between the citrus production and these high sheared hedges as an homage to a 300-year-old burial site. This is a cemetery in the midst of the farm that we wanted to honor. The Maori actually commissioned us to do this work. To be a white person from overseas, asked to work with them, was a deeply emotional connection that we had with this tribe. You can see this axial relationship to this burial mound has now been brought into honor instead of being back of house. We then worked with them to ask, how can we respectfully honor this tradition and demonstrate this tradition in the midst of the gardens around the farmhouse? And so this developed as an homage to the Maori culture of earth mounding, this terraced and abstracted landscape. This wasn't a quotation of their traditions. It's rather, how do we work with them and be inspired by this and honor it in a new way for a new generation in the future? Perhaps the most ambitious part of the work at this farm was highly aspirational project. Could we rebuild an ecology so stable, so rich, and so safe that we could reintroduce the tuatara, which is one of the most endangered animals on the planet? It's the last descendant of the Sphenodont family, which for the scientists in the room, that is the dinosaur family. These animals are highly compromised. It takes a year to gestate an egg, and we thought 9 months was bad. They're very vulnerable to the pests that have been introduced to New Zealand. New Zealand has no native mammals. Think about it. No lions, bears, tigers, stoats, weasels, cats, dogs, or people. So this amazing landmass evolved without humans and without mammals. So birds diversified to fill the niches. They also lost the ability to fly. They didn't need to, no predators. So we thought, with this massive team, not only do I have 40 creative, devoted, passionate people at Nelsonberg Wolds that work with me, but then we have hundreds of ornithologists, biologists, conservation biologists, They are our partners so deeply, but we also have these cultural geographers, archaeologists, anthropologists. So with this huge team, mostly led by Steve Sawyer, a conservation biologist in New Zealand, we set about this ambitious goal. Could we reintroduce the tuatara? And again, without an enlightened client, this would not have happened. So first step, build a predator-proof enclosure so that the weasels, stoats, possums won't eat the eggs. You'll see here there's a wire mesh, comes down, comes forward a meter just underground. Life lesson, when you get to the barrier and you dig and you dig and you dig, maybe you should back up a little bit, go under. Fortunately, they don't know that. Don't tell any mammals you know that trick. It looks like these gentlemen are straight ahead of me. You can see there's water in the distance, but this is actually where they're working. So you can draw it on paper, but these guys are the ones that build it. That's why I say the credit goes to others in all of this work. So with the predator-proof enclosure, you can see we reforested inside 80,000 trees to rebuild the rainforest inside this enclosure. We had to prove to the Department of Conservation we had a safe and stable habitat. Now the tuatara lives in a symbiotic relationship with the sooty petrels, gray-faced petrels, and fluttering shearwaters, seabirds that had not been seen on this shore for 100 years. How do we start? How do we rebuild this ecology? We had to prove that we had 3 cycles of these seabirds nesting on the peninsula before the Department of Conservation and the Maori would release tuatara into our care. This fence was inspired by Christo. I have to say, we call it our Eco Christo, the running fence project he did in Sonoma, but it's in service to a greater ecology. So again, trying to be artful with these ecological measures. These are the heroes also of this project. These are the conservation biologists that come and measure, collect data, are checking ink pad traps where critters can walk across and you can see their footprints if there are any. Fortunately, we have clean papers and we are predator free within the enclosure. This is our target species, and that is a petrel in its burrow. They dig these 8-inch deep burrows, and that's what turns on a tuatara to lay an egg. So we needed some burrows. Steve Sawyer, our ornithologist and conservation biologist, had this brilliant idea, first time it's ever been done, using solar collectors to power speakers, outdoor speakers. That's what you're seeing in the distance there. And he made a CD of gannets, petrels, fluttering shearwaters. If you ever need to gaslight someone and drive them absolutely insane, I'll give you a copy of the CD. So every evening around cocktail time, the CD starts to play thanks to the solar collector, and these seabirds way off in the distance over the Pacific start to circle in, and they start to land. He has pulled off a world's first of using these devices to attract seabirds. We now have the first new gannet colony established in the world. We have repeat pairs of fluttering shearwaters. Their numbers were reduced to 1,000 globally. This is Steve with, with a petrel that's landed on his lap. They have no fear, and no wonder they're extinct. And this is the moment that just catches your heart, where you're seeing barren, eroded land that I showed you in the early slides, covered with rainforest species, and these beautiful seabirds coming in for the night of a safe night's sleep. I'm happy to report that last year, 62 tuatara were delivered from the Department of Conservation and the Maori tribes into the enclosure, and they are absolutely thriving. This has been a 12-year journey of rebuilding this very fragile ecology, really from zero. I end with this picture because I feel like it's a way to say this image of the ocean, where we've now have blue penguins nesting in boxes. To the right is the tuatara enclosure. In the distance are the constructed wetlands, and all along the shore is the edge replanted. And in the distance, you're seeing sheep grazing land, rotational grazing that has greatly reduced the impact on this land. This is where landscape architecture stands, at the intersection, civil engineering, horticulture, conservation biology, and agriculture. Thank you for your time.
So that's just a great and I think really inspirational example of how landscape ecology principles and improving some of the heterogeneity of the natural landscape that had been lost over decades of agriculture, how that's been restored in this one particular project, and a great example of the role that landscape architects play in restoring some of the biodiversity and the ecological functioning of these landscapes. So as I mentioned, he's actually going to be presenting at CSU LA Days in April. That schedule's gone out a number of times already. Just a reminder, tonight again is the lecture by Lori Olin. So be sure to catch that. And otherwise, I hope you guys have a great weekend. Any questions? All right. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Scott.